Welcome. You're listening to Detective Duo, bringing you tales from the golden age of mystery, adventures in the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Tap subscribe to stay with us and share where in the world you're listening from. It began, as many of Tuppence Beresford's small adventures did, with a domestic irritation disguised as a burst of tidying energy. The breakfast table was still scattered with crumbs and 2 abandoned cups of coffee, one gone cold, the other half drunk and forgotten. Tommy sat behind the Times, frowning over a crossword clue that had defeated him. Tuppence, armed with resolve and a paper knife, was sorting through a pile of unopened post that had been left to accumulate since Wednesday. Honestly, Tommy, you'd think the Royal Mail was engaged in a personal vendetta. Circulars, insurance offers, one from a company promising eternal youth. Oh, here's something thrilling. A seed catalogue. Tommy grunted. At your stage of gardening, I should think the weeds are quite youthful enough. Don't be smug, she retorted, flipping through the glossy pages. Besides, I didn't even order this. Suffolk Gardeners Quarterly. Never heard of it. She was about to toss it aside when something slipped out from between the pages, a single cream envelope, blotched and wrinkled, its ink run in places like faint tears. The address, in slanted handwriting, read, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, Chelsea, London. That, Tommy said, lowering the paper, looks rather like one of those ominous beginnings you're so fond of. Tuppence didn't reply. She had already sliced it open, revealing a single folded sheet of stationery scented faintly of lavender. The writing within was hurried, desperate, yet oddly formal. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, forgive my boldness in writing, but I have reason to think you might help me. Something dreadful has happened to a friend. She walked the hollow path and did not return. The others pretend nothing is amiss. I fear I am being watched. Please, if you receive this, come at once to Hollow End. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Drake. There was no return address beyond Hollow End, Suffolk. The bottom of the letter was smudged where the ink had run, as though caught in the rain. Tuppence read it twice, then folded it carefully and sat very still. Well? Tommy asked, half smiling. Sounds like one of those village ghost pieces you clip from the papers. Ghost, my foot, she said sharply. It's dated 6 weeks ago, and we've only just found it. Someone posted this, Tommy, someone real. 6 weeks is a long time. If something dreadful truly happened, I dare say the police— Don't, she interrupted, with that spark he recognized, the one that meant the sensible argument was already lost. You remember that case in Cornwall? Everyone thought the lady had simply run off to the seaside. He sighed, folding the Times. I suppose it's useless suggesting that this Eleanor Drake is a figment of your romantic imagination. Tuppence ignored the barb, reaching for another letter on the pile, a crumpled clipping from a local newspaper someone had used as padding. The bold headline read, Woman still missing from Hollow End. Below it, a brief article. Mrs. Eleanor Drake, wife of Mr. Victor Drake of Hollow End Hall, has been missing since early March. Foul play is not suspected. Not suspected, Tuppence exclaimed. It never is, until it's too late. Tommy leaned over to read. Suffolk, that's a fair distance. Perhaps she wrote before she vanished. Perhaps this letter got lost in the post. Or perhaps, Tuppence murmured, eyes narrowing, someone didn't want it delivered at all. A silence settled over the cosy Chelsea sitting room, the kind that made the ticking clock suddenly conspicuous. Outside, a milk cart rattled past. Tommy looked at her over the paper edge. Go on, say it. She smiled faintly. You'll come with me, of course. Of course, he said, because they both knew he always did. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked to the window. The sunlight struck the glass, throwing her reflection back at her. A woman with keen eyes and a restless mind, who would never be content while a mystery dangled just beyond reach. I wonder what she meant, Tuppence said softly, by the path that isn't there anymore. Tommy shrugged. A poetic turn of phrase, perhaps, or bad cartography. But she didn't laugh. Her gaze had gone distant, fixed on something neither of them could yet see. They spent the rest of the morning tracing any reference to Hollow End. Tuppence spread maps and gazetteers across the dining table, muttering the name as if it might conjure a revelation. Population 300, Tommy read aloud from an old guidebook. 1 inn, 1 church, a forge, and a disused railway spur. Picturesque enough. I expect it's crawling with geraniums and gossip." "That's what worries me," she said. "Places that look harmless rarely are." By noon, she had arranged the letter, the clipping, and a fresh notebook on her writing desk, like sacred artifacts. "We'll take the morning train to Ipswich and hire a car from there. I want to see this hollow end with my own eyes." Tommy, in the act of lighting his pipe, gave a resigned grunt. "And suppose it's all a misunderstanding, that Mrs. Drake simply fancied a change of scenery?" Tuppence's smile was mischievous but determined. "Then we'll have had a perfectly nice drive in the country. But if it's not, he finished, we're walking straight into another of your little escapades." "Exactly," she said. "And don't pretend you mind." That evening, as she prepared their bags, Tuppence caught herself glancing repeatedly at the letter lying on her dresser. There was something peculiar about the way the ink faded toward the end, the desperate rush of the final lines, as though the writer had been interrupted. She traced the faint indentation at the bottom where the pen had pressed harder, then noticed, half hidden beneath the signature, a blurred mark that might once have been a number. She fetched a pencil and lightly shaded the paper until faint digits emerged. 14, the green. "Tommy!" she called. She did give an address after all. 14, the green hollow end. From the sitting room came his familiar reply. "Then we've no excuse left, have we?" Tuppence smiled, folding the letter carefully into her handbag. The moment felt oddly solemn, as if they had just accepted an invitation that could not be rescinded. She looked around the room, fireplace glowing, books half read, the little clock ticking with domestic cheer, and felt the faintest chill despite the warmth. The Beresfords had solved their share of riddles before, but this one was different. There was something about that phrase, looping through her mind like a melody half forgotten, the path that isn't there anymore, a letter mislaid, a woman vanished, and somewhere in the Suffolk countryside, a path waiting to be found, or to disappear entirely. As Tommy put out the lights and locked the door, he said lightly, "Well, old thing, let's hope Hollow End lives up to its name." Tuppence's laughter lingered in the dark hall, bright but edged with curiosity, the sound of adventure beginning again. The train from Ipswich rattled through the Suffolk countryside like a memory reluctant to fade. Fields stretched in wide, sleepy folds under a sky too pale to decide between sun and cloud. Tuppence watched hedgerows pass, as though they might spell out the answer to the letter she still carried in her handbag. "Hollow End next," called the guard, sliding open the compartment door. "Not much of a stop, mind." Tommy looked up from the Times. "I don't like the sound of that," he murmured. "Places described as not much of a stop rarely boast a decent tea." Tuppence smiled, closing her compact. "Then it's a good thing we didn't come for the tea." The train shuddered, slowed, and sighed to a halt beside a platform barely large enough for a picnic rug. A single porter, ancient and motionless as an oak stump, watched them disembark without curiosity. The station sign, crooked and faded, declared Hollow End. They walked the half-mile to the village in companionable silence, suitcases bumping along the lane. The air was heavy with the scent of damp grass and wood smoke. Somewhere, unseen, a dog barked twice and fell silent. It was a village of honeyed stone and shuttered windows, every cottage neat and self-contained. Yet something in its stillness felt staged. The sound of their footsteps seemed too loud, the air too intent on listening. "Picturesque," Tommy said finally, "in the way a wax museum is picturesque." Tuppence nodded. "It's like the whole place forgot to breathe." They found the inn, a square ivy-draped building with a painted sign depicting a cheerful lamb that somehow didn't make the place seem less forbidding. The doorbell jingled with a sound that was too shrill for the hush outside. Inside, the smell of polish and old ale greeted them, along with a woman who might have stepped straight out of a Sunday sermon. Mrs. Lacey, the innkeeper, was plump, pink-faced, and visibly uncomfortable at having visitors. "Rooms, is it?" she asked. "2, if you can spare them," Tuppence said brightly. "We've come for a few days walking. Lovely countryside." Mrs. Lacey hesitated, eyes flicking from one to the other. "We don't get many walkers," she said. "Not since the railway stopped the goods line." "We're a rare breed," Tommy replied. "City folk pretending to be rustic. You must find us terribly foolish." Her mouth twitched, nearly a smile. "Not foolish, sir, just curious." While Mrs. Lacey led them up the creaking staircase, Tuppence glanced at the framed photographs on the wall. Sepia faces of villagers long gone, all staring stiffly at the camera as if defying it to remember them. Their rooms were small but spotless. A jug of water on the washstand, curtains drawn tight. From somewhere outside came the uneven chime of the church clock, 2 notes too close together, like a heartbeat faltering. "Even the clock sounds nervous," Tuppence murmured. Downstairs again, over tea, she asked casually, "Do you happen to know a Mrs. Drake, Eleanor Drake? She lives here, I think." The teacup froze halfway to Mrs. Lacey's lips. Then she set it down carefully. "No, madam, no Drake here." "But perhaps nearby, at Hollow End Hall?" The woman's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shuttered. "Never heard of it," she said firmly. At the next table, a man reading a farming journal rustled his pages too loudly. When Tuppence glanced his way, he kept his gaze fixed on the print. Tommy caught her eye, tilting his head minutely toward the window. Outside, 2 villagers passing along the lane slowed, glanced toward the inn, then walked faster. Later, when Mrs. Lacey had withdrawn, Tommy leaned closer. "I've known people less jumpy in a blackout." "She's lying," Tuppence whispered. "Or afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of who?" she corrected softly. They spent the afternoon exploring. Hollow End was not large, a green where ducks waddled indifferently, a church leaning slightly against time, a smithy long derelict. Beyond it, the land fell away into a shallow valley cut by a stream. A boy, freckled and barefoot, was throwing pebbles into the water. He stared at them with open curiosity. "Good afternoon," Tuppence said cheerfully. "Is this the hollow path?" The boy frowned. "Ain't supposed to call it that," he muttered. "What do you call it, then?" "Just the old way," he said. "But folks don't walk it now, not since—" He stopped, glancing nervously toward the woods. "Sometimes people go missing for a bit, that's all." "Missing?" Tommy asked. The boy shrugged, trying for nonchalance. "They come back, mostly." Then, without another word, he bolted up the hill and vanished behind the church. Tommy exhaled. Charming little hamlet, this. "Tommy," Tuppence said slowly. He said mostly. They followed the lane until it ended abruptly at a field where a footpath ought to have continued. Yet there was none, only nettles and a sagging fence. On the village map by the post office, the path was marked clearly. On the ground, it had vanished. Tommy crouched, examining the soil. Overgrown, yes, but this looks filled in, deliberately. "Someone didn't want it walked," Tuppence said. "The path that isn't there anymore." Her voice carried a tremor that wasn't entirely fear, more like anticipation. Evening brought a thin mist and a handful of flickering lamps. They dined alone in the inn parlour, Mrs. Lacey's politeness stretched tight as wire. Outside, the wind made the sign creak softly on its hinge. "You know," Tommy said, cutting into a rather resilient steak and kidney pudding, "if I were writing one of your mystery novels, I'd put a secret society in the next cottage and a murder in the church vestry." Tuppence gave him a sideways smile. "You'd sell millions, but I prefer facts." At that moment, the door opened, and a tall, angular man entered, saluting Mrs. Lacey with a stiff nod. His moustache could have cut glass. "Evening, Colonel," Mrs. Lacey murmured. "Evening," he barked, then turned toward the Beresfords. "Visitors?" Tommy rose politely. "Tommy and Prudence Blunt," he said, adopting their old pseudonym with a flicker of amusement. "A pleasure, Colonel." "Harbottle," the man said shortly. "Retired. Birds, mostly. You'll hear my lenses clicking if you're up at dawn." "Bird watching?" Tuppence asked. He twitched, a tiny jerk of the head. "One must keep one's eye trained. Observation, Mrs. Blunt, is the soul of safety." With that cryptic remark, he retreated to a corner table and began cleaning his binoculars with soldierly precision. Tuppence leaned close. "Tommy, that man twitches every time someone mentions safety." "Harmless hobbyist," Tommy said. "Or perhaps he's photographing spies in the hedgerows." She laughed softly. "Either way, I intend to find out." That night, from their adjoining rooms, the village lay silent beneath a brittle moon. Tommy couldn't sleep. He found himself at the window watching the black line of the woods beyond the church. Then he saw it, a faint movement of light between the trees, a lantern perhaps, or the reflection of something metallic. It flickered twice, then vanished. He hesitated before knocking lightly on the wall between their rooms. "Tuppence?" Her voice came through, sleepy but alert. "Yes?" "Someone's moving out there, in the woods." There was a pause, then the sound of her footsteps crossing the floor. She appeared at his door, wrapped in a dressing gown, hair tousled but eyes sharp. "Show me." They stood together at the window. Nothing now but stillness and shadows. "You see?" Tommy said softly. "Yes," Tuppence murmured. "And I don't like it. Not one bit." She turned from the glass. "Tomorrow we ask about that forge, and the missing path. And perhaps," she added, voice tightening with purpose, "why everyone in Hollow End has forgotten the name Eleanor Drake." Tommy nodded. "And if they haven't forgotten, they're pretending to." The clock downstairs struck 11, once, then again, as if uncertain it should have dared. In the silence that followed, even the village seemed to hold its breath. It was the smell that led her there, a mingling of scorched metal, oil, and something faintly herbal, like rosemary burning on coal. Tuppence had always trusted her nose more than most people's words, and Hollow End's air was thick with things unsaid. Tommy had gone off toward the village green to sample local gossip, by which he meant insinuate himself into the pub and charm free information out of ale-stained tongues. That left her to pursue the subtler line of inquiry, the one that might reveal what Hollow End was too polite to voice. The old forge stood at the far end of the lane, half buried in elder bushes. Its sign, Mallory's Forge, swung crookedly on one chain, creaking softly whenever a breeze stirred. The place looked deserted, but as she drew near, Tuppence heard the faint, rhythmic clang of hammer on metal, an oddly comforting sound, like the heart of the village still beating when everything else seemed still. She knocked, then pushed open the door. The heat rolled out first, followed by the glint of sparks and a voice that said, without turning, "Door's open. Mind your skirt. There's filings on the floor." "Thank you," Tuppence said, brushing a bit of soot from her glove. "Mr. Mallory, I presume?" The man looked up from his anvil. He was tall and lean, with hair gone silver at the temples and eyes that seemed to weigh everything they saw. He studied her without haste. "Depends who's asking." She smiled. A harmless tourist with a fondness for village crafts and an insatiable curiosity. Mrs. Blunt. That earned her the faintest flicker of amusement. "You'll be disappointed, Mrs. Blunt. We don't make souvenirs here." "I'd settle for conversation," she said, producing her most disarming smile. "And perhaps a cup of tea? I'm told you make both iron and scandal in this village." He hesitated, then shrugged and set down his hammer. "You'd better come through, then. The kettle's on, always is." The living quarters behind the forge were surprisingly tidy, though the air held the faint tang of metal and smoke. Everything was ordered with military precision. A chair angled just so, books arranged by size rather than subject. Mallory poured boiling water into a battered teapot and set it down between them. "You're not from here," he said, as if testing the obvious. "No, my husband and I are visiting. We'd heard of Hollow End's charm and its mysteries." "Mysteries?" He stirred his tea with a clean metal rod instead of a spoon. "That's one word for it." "You've had changes," Tuppence said lightly, "since the new owners came to the estate." His hand paused mid-stir. "The Drakes." "Yes. Were they popular?" Mallory gave a soft laugh, dry as coal dust. "Popular? No one here's been popular since the war. They kept to themselves. Or perhaps the village kept away from them." "Mrs. Drake?" He looked at her then, properly, and something shuttered behind his eyes. "A kind woman. Restless, though. Always walking." "Walking?" She said it helped her think. Always up by the church, then down the hollow path. "You know it?" Tuppence shook her head. "Only by name." His jaw tightened. "A mistake, that path. It should have been fenced years ago. Water runs under it. Old ground, soft ground. People get lost." "Lost," she repeated softly. He nodded once. "She went that way one evening, never came back." The air between them thickened. The kettle hissed on the stove, ignored. "Were you the last to see her?" Tuppence asked. "I might have been." He looked away. "But I don't talk about that." "Why not?" He met her eyes again, hard now. "Because some things round here are better left buried." Back in the village, Tommy found himself leaning at the bar of the King's Stag, nursing a pint that tasted faintly of despair. The locals had been slow to speak at first, but a few coins and the right tone of urban stupidity worked wonders. "Mrs. Drake, you say?" repeated a heavy-set man in a brown cap. "Oh, her. Lovely woman, that one. Bit delicate, though. Too many novels, if you get me." "You mean romantic?" Tommy prompted. "Exactly. That sort. Always walking alone, writing letters, staring at the church as if it'd answer back. I say she ran off with someone. That London chap, tall fella in the motor car. Saw him twice, I did." "Really?" Tommy said mildly. "And what did the husband think?" The man snorted. "Mr. Drake. Never saw much of him. Spent most nights up at Ipswich or in London. Business, he said. Well, it was his wife who had the money, wasn't it? Inherited from her father. She vanished and he stayed gone." A woman at the end of the bar leaned over. "They found her handbag, though," she said in a low voice. "Empty, behind the churchyard wall." "Empty?" Tommy echoed. "Not a penny, not a note. As if someone wanted to say she'd gone off by choice, but forgot to make it believable." There was an uncomfortable silence. Then the landlord coughed and changed the subject to the weather. Tommy finished his pint, thanked them all cheerfully, and made a mental note that gossip was Hollow End's chief export. But even gossip had boundaries here. By twilight, he found Tuppence sitting on the low stone wall outside the forge, watching the valley darken. "Any luck?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Depends what you call luck," she said. "I found a man who talks in riddles and drinks tea with the precision of a clockmaker. He saw Eleanor Drake walking toward the hollow path the night she disappeared." Tommy frowned. "That's something, though it sounds like everyone here has been instructed to forget it." She nodded slowly. Yet they all remember it just enough to look frightened. As they spoke, the forge door creaked. Mallory stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Evening," he said, voice neutral. "Forgot this." He reached into his pocket, but a gust of wind caught the cloth he carried. Something fell from it. A glove, small and cream-coloured, the sort meant for gardening. Tuppence stooped automatically to pick it up. It was new. Too new. The initials E.D. were neatly embroidered along the cuff. "Oh," she said softly, "I think this is yours." Mallory hesitated just a fraction too long. "No. Belonged to Mrs. Drake, I suppose. Must have been left behind when they cleared the house." "You kept it?" He shrugged. "Someone has to keep the past tidy." He took the glove and vanished inside before they could reply. Tommy exhaled. "Friendly sort, isn't he?" "He's hiding something," Tuppence murmured. "But what exactly? Pity isn't the same as guilt." "Nor is fear," Tommy said. "And this village is thick with both." She looked toward the woods where the first lamps were blinking on. "Tommy, what if Eleanor Drake didn't run away? What if she tried to, and someone stopped her?" He gave a low whistle. "Then we're not just on a country holiday anymore." "Were we ever?" she said, standing. They walked back to the inn in near silence. Behind them, the forge door closed with a soft thud, final, almost deliberate. The last thing Tuppence saw before turning away was a faint glow of lamplight flickering through the window, glinting off the curved edge of something metallic and sharp. It looked, she thought uneasily, rather like the blade of a spade. It was Tuppence's idea, naturally. "Everyone keeps telling us not to go down it," she said that morning at breakfast, pouring tea with an expression of deliberate innocence. "And I've always thought that the quickest way to find a secret is to step exactly where you're told not to." Tommy, who had just bitten into a slice of toast, sighed. "You mean we're going to spend our morning tramping through a bramble-infested ditch that may or may not eat people?" "Don't exaggerate," Tuppence replied, adjusting her hat in the mirror. "It's a sunken lane, not a carnivorous bog. Besides, you've been itching for adventure since Tuesday." Tommy folded his newspaper and stood. "I must have been a very foolish man on Tuesday." Mrs. Lacey's reaction when they mentioned their destination confirmed their decision. The innkeeper went pale and dropped a teaspoon into the sugar bowl. "You'll not find anything pleasant down there," she said quietly. "The hollow path's not been walked since, well, it don't stay the same from one day to the next." "Doesn't it?" Tuppence asked sweetly. "How versatile of it." Mrs. Lacey only shook her head and refused to say more. The entrance to the hollow path lay beyond the churchyard, through a wooden gate warped by weather. The lane dropped steeply between banks so overgrown they met in an arch overhead, blotting out the sunlight. The air smelled of wet earth and old leaves. Tommy stopped at the threshold and frowned. "Looks like it's been deliberately blocked," he said, brushing aside a tangle of brambles. "Blocked to people who lack initiative," Tuppence replied, ducking under. Her voice sounded oddly muffled in the tunnel of green. They began their descent, feet sinking slightly into the damp soil. The farther they went, the narrower the path grew, as if the earth itself resented intrusion. The roots of trees jutted from the banks like gnarled fingers. Small birds rustled unseen above them, and once Tuppence thought she heard running water. It was not the kind of place where one wanted to speak loudly. After 10 minutes of silence, Tommy said, "This would be charming if it weren't so infernally sinister." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You're learning. The sinister is always the charming in disguise." The lane twisted suddenly left, then opened onto a clearing where the path ended abruptly at the remains of a footbridge. What had once spanned the narrow brook was now a mess of collapsed planks and moss-covered timbers. The water below moved sluggishly, brown and thick. "Lovely," Tommy said. "You didn't mention swimming." Tuppence ignored him, crouching to examine the edge of the path. Something pale caught the light, a scrap of fabric snagged on a splintered post. She tugged it free, a torn piece of silk, faintly patterned with blue flowers. "It's from a scarf," she murmured, "and it's not as weathered as it should be." Tommy examined it over her shoulder. "You think it's hers?" "It might be." She tucked it carefully into her pocket. "And if so, someone's been here more recently than 6 weeks ago." They crossed the stream cautiously by hopping across the remaining stones. On the other side, the path continued for a short distance before vanishing into thick undergrowth. Tuppence brushed her gloves clean, but froze suddenly. "Tommy, look." At the muddy edge of the brook, pressed clearly into the earth, was the mark of a gloved hand. Not an old imprint either. Its edges were sharp, and the mud within it was still drying. Tommy knelt to inspect it. "That's not old. Day or two at most." Tuppence straightened, eyes scanning the trees. The air seemed to change then, still, waiting. "Someone's been here, watching perhaps." "Or crossing," Tommy suggested lightly, though his own gaze had gone sharp. "Plenty of innocent explanations." She gave him a look. "And when have we ever found the innocent one correct?" They followed the stream until it curved toward open farmland. The trees thinned and a wooden stile led into a field of tall grass. A man was working there, bent over a row of posts with a hammer in hand. He looked up as they approached, a broad-shouldered fellow with sunburned cheeks and wary eyes. "Morning," Tommy called. "Fine day for mending fences." The man squinted. "Depends what you're keeping in, or out." "Quite so." Tommy extended a hand. "Name's Blunt. My wife and I were admiring your, craftsmanship." The man's handshake was brief, strong. "Ned," he said simply. "Farmhand up at the Grange. Don't see many strangers round here." "We were exploring the hollow path," Tuppence said. At once Ned's expression changed. "You walked it?" "Part of it. Why?" He wiped his hands on his trousers. "That path don't stay where it ought to. Shifts when it wants to." Tuppence raised an eyebrow. "Shifts?" He nodded earnestly. "Aye. Bit of old ground down there, hollowed by water and roots. You can go down one day and find it straight enough. Go the next and it's different. Ask anyone round here." "Sounds inconvenient," Tommy said. "Inconvenience one word, dangerous is another." Ned glanced toward the woods. "The Drake's property backs onto it, see? She, Mrs. Drake, used to walk that way often enough. After she went missing, I stopped mending fences near it. Don't like the place." "Did you know her?" Tuppence asked. Ned hesitated. "Everyone knew of her. Nice lady. Didn't deserve what she got." "What did she get?" He hesitated again, then said quietly, "Ask Mr. Drake. He'll tell you." "And where might we find him?" "In London, last I heard. Left quick after she vanished. Didn't come back." There was something final in the way he said it, as if the absence of Mr. Drake were both explanation and accusation. Before Tuppence could ask more, a distant bell clanged from the farm and Ned gave a curt nod. "Best get back," he said. "You do well to stay off that path. It don't like strangers." He strode away, leaving them alone in the field with the sound of the wind through dry grass. Tommy leaned on the stile, watching him go. "Well, there's a cheerful local superstition." Tuppence was staring at the path behind them. He's right about one thing. It feels alive somehow, as if it's been walked too often by the same person, and not enough by anyone else. He smiled faintly. That's poetical. Are you writing a memoir? She ignored the tease. Did you notice? He said the path shifts. But what if he wasn't being fanciful? What if someone wants it to appear different, wants it hidden? Hidden? She gestured toward the undergrowth. Suppose Eleanor Drake's disappearance wasn't an accident. Suppose someone used that path to make her vanish, and then made sure no one could follow. Tommy looked back toward the trees where the arching boughs formed a shadowed tunnel. You mean it's not the path that moves, it's the people covering it. Exactly. For a long moment, they stood listening. The brook gurgled softly, a harmless sound, yet the entire landscape seemed to hold its breath. Tuppence shivered despite the mild air. Let's go back. I've had enough of this hollow for one day. They retraced their steps to the broken bridge. Midway across, Tuppence's foot slipped on the slick wood, and she gave a sharp cry. Tommy caught her just in time, his arm steadying her against the rail. Steady now, he murmured. You nearly joined the missing. She managed to laugh, though her heart was racing, and I hadn't even left a handbag behind. They crossed the rest of the way in silence. Once safe on the other side, Tuppence turned back for one last look. The hollow path lay quiet, the brook glinting faintly in the dim light. Yet as she watched, she thought she saw a flicker of movement among the trees, a shadow perhaps, or a person stepping silently deeper into the undergrowth. When she blinked, it was gone. Come on, Tommy said, taking her arm. The villagers may think we're mad, but I prefer being mad in daylight. They reached the inn as dusk began to gather, the lamps inside already glowing warmly. Mrs. Lacey met them in the hallway, eyes flicking to their muddied shoes. You've been walking, she said flatly. Tuppence smiled. Just a little ramble. Very refreshing. Some rambles end badly, Mrs. Lacey said, almost to herself. Best leave old paths be. Tommy tipped his hat. I'll keep that in mind, madam. As they went upstairs, Tuppence looked over her shoulder. The innkeeper was still watching them, face unreadable. In their room, she set the scrap of silk on the dressing table. The blue flowers seemed to shimmer faintly in the lamplight. Tommy glanced at it and said quietly, You're thinking what I'm thinking. Yes, she murmured. Someone's been back to the hollow path, recently, and if Mrs. Drake is truly gone, someone else isn't finished with her yet. Outside, the church clock struck 6, slow, uneven, the final note lingering too long in the still air. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. It was Tuppence who noticed the hedge first, tall, immaculate, and too well kept for a property said to be empty. Do you see? She said, standing at the edge of the lane, her gloved hand resting on the gate. You don't trim hedges like that unless someone's watching. Tommy peered through the narrow opening where the gravel drive curved away, or unless someone doesn't want to be seen watching. The Drake estate, Hollow End Hall, stood beyond the hedge, a pale stone house crouched in silence. A faint film of neglect clung to it, but the grounds betrayed discipline. Trimmed shrubs, no weeds, the lawn clipped with precision. A paradox, and Tuppence loved paradoxes. I'm still not convinced this isn't trespassing, Tommy said. It isn't, she countered, smoothing her skirt. It's house hunting, a respectable pastime for middle-aged adventurers with a taste for rural quiet. You mean we're pretending to buy the place? Exactly. Now, look enthusiastic, as if you can already see me in the drawing room scolding the maid about teacups. He sighed, but followed as she pushed open the gate. The crunch of gravel underfoot seemed unnaturally loud in the hush. Somewhere a pigeon cooed lazily from the eaves. The front door, though weathered, bore a polished brass knocker. Tuppence lifted it and struck twice. The sound echoed down a hallway that seemed hollow of life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a latch clicked, and the door opened just enough to reveal a face, narrow, severe, and framed by iron-grey hair. Yes? Good afternoon, Tuppence began in her brightest, most genteel tone. I'm Mrs. Blunt, this is my husband. We heard the hall might be for sale, and we're looking for a small country property. The woman's eyes, small, dark, and suspicious, flicked from Tuppence to Tommy and back. Who told you that? Oh, just local talk, Tuppence said airily. Perhaps we were misinformed. A pause. Then the door opened wider. "I'm Miss Pusey. The house isn't for sale." "Oh, what a pity," Tuppence said, smiling sweetly. "Still, since we're here, might we have a look round? One never knows. Perhaps the owners could be persuaded." Miss Pusey hesitated, torn between suspicion and the ingrained obedience of a housekeeper used to visitors. Finally, she stepped aside. "Very well, but you'll not find it comfortable. Mrs. Drake hasn't been here for some time." The words hung between them as they entered. The hall smelled faintly of lavender polish and dust. Light filtered through high windows, catching the edges of picture frames and gleaming on the parquet floor. Everything was neat. Too neat, Tommy thought, like a stage set waiting for its actors. Tuppence trailed her fingers along a sideboard. "You keep it beautifully," she said. "It's my duty," Miss Pusey replied curtly. "Mrs. Drake liked things in order." "She must have," Tuppence murmured. "Though I suppose it's hard, keeping it up without—" The housekeeper's expression froze her words mid-sentence. "We manage," Miss Pusey said shortly. "This way, please." She led them through a drawing-room where the curtains were half-drawn, muting the daylight into a dusky calm. The air smelled faintly of roses gone dry. A grand piano stood closed, a sheet of music still propped open to moonlight in May. Tuppence noticed a fine layer of dust on the keys, except for one, where a faint smudge broke the pattern. Someone had touched it recently. They passed into a dining room where the table was laid for two. The plates gleamed faintly under glass domes. "How charming," Tuppence said lightly. "It almost feels as if she's just stepped out for a walk." Miss Pusey's lips tightened. "Perhaps." They moved next into a small morning room lined with books. Tuppence paused by the fireplace where a vase of dead flowers drooped over a grey scattering of ash. "Do you live here alone, Miss Pusey?" "For now. Mr. Drake visits occasionally, when business allows." "Business?" "London mostly. He travels." Tommy caught Tuppence's eye. A flicker of thought passed between them. The missing husband, the perfectly maintained house, the two clean surfaces. At the end of a long corridor, a set of glass doors opened into the conservatory. The air was warmer here, thick with the scent of damp soil and decaying plants. Ivy curled around the glass panes and the light fell in dappled gold across the tiled floor. "This was Mrs. Drake's favourite room," Miss Pusey said, her tone softer for the first time. "She used to take her tea here in the afternoons." Tuppence stepped carefully between the plant stands. A small table stood near the window, a tea tray still set upon it. The silver had tarnished, but the china was intact, except for one teacup, cracked clean through with a faint pink mark along the rim. Lipstick. She bent closer. The colour looked startlingly fresh. "How long did you say Mrs. Drake's been gone?" Tuppence asked. 6 weeks, Miss Pusey said without hesitation. Tuppence straightened slowly. "And you've left everything exactly as it was." "I told you," the woman said sharply. She liked things in order. The air felt heavier now, the quiet too complete. Even Tommy's usual dry remark failed to surface. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, a sound shattered the stillness, a sharp, metallic ring. Tuppence turned, startled. "A telephone?" Miss Pusey went rigid. "There's no line working here." "But I heard it." "You must be mistaken," the housekeeper said coldly. "The wires were cut when Mrs. Drake left. Come along." She turned briskly toward the corridor, but Tuppence lingered a moment longer, eyes scanning the corners of the conservatory. Somewhere behind the walls, faint but distinct, she thought she heard the click of a receiver being replaced. In the hall, Tommy had noticed something else. A faint line of footprints marked the otherwise perfect layer of dust along the floorboards, prints leading away from the staircase toward a small, closed door beneath it. "Miss Pusey," he said casually, "what's behind here?" She hesitated. "The servants' quarters. Disused now." "Mind if I—" "You'll not," she snapped, stepping between him and the handle. "It's locked. Nothing there but old furniture." "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Wouldn't dream of prying." Her eyes narrowed. "I think you've seen enough." Tuppence reappeared then, smoothing her gloves as if the awkwardness were merely a draught. "You've been very kind, Miss Pusey. The house is fascinating, though perhaps too large for us after all." Miss Pusey led them to the door with the kind of politeness that was almost a dismissal. As Tuppence stepped over the threshold, she felt rather than saw the woman's gaze following her, sharp, assessing, like a door closing without sound. Outside, the light had shifted. The hedge gleamed faintly with dew, and the gravel underfoot sparkled. They walked until the hall disappeared behind the trees before speaking. "Well," Tommy asked, "do we buy it?" "I'd take it tomorrow," Tuppence said, "though I'd prefer a tenant who wasn't haunting the conservatory." Tommy gave a low whistle. "Lipstick, you said?" "Still fresh." "And the phone call?" "I heard it as plainly as I hear you. Yet Miss Pusey swore there's no line. Either she's lying, or someone's using another one." Tommy frowned. "A second line, servants perhaps, or something more recent." "And the footprints," she added, "leading to a locked door, a woman's voice on the phone, perhaps, calling from inside." He considered that. If so, she's very quiet about it. Tuppence looked back toward the hedge, where the faint outline of the halls showed between leaves. "No, Tommy, not quiet. Careful. Someone's living in that house still, and Miss Pusey knows exactly who." She drew from her pocket the folded scrap of scarf from the hollow path, smoothing it against her palm. "Eleanor Drake walked into the woods and vanished, but something tells me she came back again, at least for a cup of tea." Tommy's voice softened. "Then perhaps she never really left at all." Tuppence's eyes met his. "Or perhaps she left, and someone came back pretending to be her." The air around them seemed to still. From far off came the uneven chime of the church clock, echoing faintly over the fields. "Whatever's behind that hedge," Tuppence said quietly, "isn't finished with Hollow End yet." Tommy Beresford had never liked London in late spring. It always looked as though it had dressed itself for summer too early, all gloss on the surface and a chill underneath. The taxis hissed through puddles left by a morning shower, and even Piccadilly looked sulky under its damp lamplight. He folded his umbrella and stepped out of the cab before the solicitor's office, a tall, respectable building smelling faintly of beeswax and caution. Inside, a clock ticked too loudly, and a clerk with an expression like a closed door ushered him into a small panelled room. "Mr. Felton will see you now," the clerk murmured, and vanished as if relieved to do so. Mr. Felton, the Drake family solicitor, was round, pink, and evasive, a man who had made a lifetime profession of not knowing anything that might later be inconvenient. He rose from behind his desk with a cautious smile. "Mr. Blunt, was it? Mrs. Drake's, associate?" Tommy returned the smile blandly. "A friend of the family, let's say. I'm making a few discreet inquiries on their behalf." "Ah, discreet." Felton gestured for him to sit. "A rare and valuable quality." "Quite. I understand you handled some recent transactions for Mr. Drake, before his wife's unfortunate disappearance." The solicitor's face rearranged itself into professional sorrow. "A most distressing business, yes. Mrs. Drake, charming woman, cultured, generous." "And rather wealthy, wasn't she?" Felton hesitated. "Moderately so. She inherited certain properties, small holdings in Suffolk, and a trust fund from her late father. Perfectly ordinary." "Ordinary enough for her husband to start selling them off?" The man's pen paused in mid-tap. "I beg your pardon?" Tommy leaned back. "I have reason to believe Mr. Victor Drake disposed of several parcels of land a few weeks before his wife disappeared. I was wondering whether those sales passed through your office." Felton coughed delicately. "Mr. Drake did request some transfers, yes. Entirely legitimate, I assure you. The proceeds were invested abroad, or so he said." "Did Mrs. Drake sign the papers?" "I believe so, yes." But the way he said it made the word sound fragile. Tommy's eyes narrowed. "Believe or no?" Felton straightened a stack of papers with unnecessary care. "The signatures were in order. I see no reason to suspect irregularity." "No reason, perhaps," Tommy said lightly, "but quite a number of opportunities." The solicitor cleared his throat. "If you'll forgive me, Mr. Blunt, I'm not at liberty to discuss private client matters." "Of course," Tommy said cheerfully, rising, "but you've been extremely helpful. One hates to trouble Scotland Yard unnecessarily, though I'm sure they'll be delighted to review the documentation for themselves." Felton went slightly grey. "That won't be necessary, I assure you." Tommy smiled and offered his hand. "Good man. I knew we'd understand each other." Outside, the street smelled of wet pavement and roasted chestnuts. Tommy bought a paper from a vendor and tucked it under his arm, thinking. A man who sold his wife's property in secret before she vanished. That was one kind of husband. A man who then fled the village altogether was quite another. Victor Drake's London address proved to be a tall building off Bayswater Road, respectable enough, though the paint on the door frames had begun to curl. A caretaker opened the door with a rag in one hand and suspicion in the other. "Mr. Drake?" Tommy asked. The man shook his head. "Hasn't been here for weeks. Left no word neither. Lot of people asking after him lately." "Oh? What sort of people?" The caretaker scratched his chin. "Polite ones, mostly. A lady, too. Came near every night for a week. Grey coat, smart shoes. Didn't use the front door, though." Tommy's interest sharpened. "The side entrance?" "Aye. Slipped in after dark, quiet as you please. Never stayed long. Last time I saw her, she looked right through me. Eyes like a ghost's." Tommy handed him a coin. "You've been most illuminating." As he turned away, he made a note in his pocketbook. Grey coat. Late-night visits. Not Mrs. Drake. Unless, of course, it was. Meanwhile, in Hollow End, Tuppence was at the inn's small writing desk, surrounded by open notebooks and half-finished thoughts. Her handwriting meandered across the page, part observation, part intuition. Day 6. Village still pretending to know nothing. Miss Pusey seen entering the churchyard after dusk, carrying a parcel. Claims it was flowers. Doubtful. She paused, nibbling the end of her pencil, then added, "Mrs. Lacey nervous, but talkative with a bit of sherry." A soft knock came at her door. It was the innkeeper herself, rosy-cheeked and fluttering with apology. "I didn't mean to interrupt, dear. Thought you might like some tea." Tuppence smiled. "You're an angel. Sit with me, won't you?" Mrs. Lacey hesitated, then perched on the edge of a chair. "I'm not much for gossip, mind, but I do keep dreams." "Dreams?" "Yes. Since Mrs. Drake vanished, I keep dreaming of her, standing in the lane after midnight carrying something heavy, her face all pale, as if the moonlight had got under her skin. I tell myself it's nonsense, but it feels too real." Tuppence leaned forward. What was she carrying? I couldn't see clear. A box, perhaps, or a case. She looked tired, poor thing, as if she'd been walking a long way. "Did you tell anyone?" Mrs. Lacey shook her head quickly. "What good would it do? People don't like talk of ghosts here." Tuppence reached across and patted her hand. "I don't believe in ghosts either. Only secrets that pretend to be them." The next afternoon, Tommy returned from London with the look of a man who had seen enough bureaucracy to last him a lifetime. He found Tuppence in the inn parlour, her notebook open beside a plate of scones. "Well?" she asked, eyes alight. "Well," he said, dropping into the chair opposite, "our Mr. Victor Drake has been busy. He sold off chunks of his wife's inheritance before she disappeared. Cash, not property, and he didn't hang around to spend it locally." Tuppence frowned. "So motive becomes profit. But there's more." He nodded. "There was a woman. Grey coat, nightly visits to his flat. Never seen leaving by the door. The caretaker swears she was real." Her brow furrowed. "A mistress, perhaps? Or an accomplice?" "Or," Tommy said quietly, "a wife who wasn't supposed to exist anymore." The words hung in the air. Tuppence closed her notebook slowly. If she was alive, why hide? Unless she feared someone finding her. Tommy leaned forward. Or unless someone else was pretending to be her, to cover what happened. She met his gaze, thoughtful. "You know, Tommy, we may be looking at this the wrong way round. Everyone assumes Eleanor Drake vanished from Hollow End. But what if she vanished to it?" He grinned. "Meaning?" "Meaning she left London to escape something, or someone. And Hollow End, with its silence and secrets, was her refuge, until it wasn't." He nodded slowly. "You're right. That village knows more than it says. The question is, what's it protecting?" She stood, slipping the scarf scrap back into her handbag. "Let's find out. Tomorrow we pay another visit to the house behind the hedge." Tommy smiled faintly. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As he rose to fetch his coat, the church clock struck outside. Once, then again, unevenly, as if echoing the thought between them. The past had not yet finished speaking. Tommy arrived back in Hollow End with the sense that the air itself was holding its breath. The train had been late, the taxi driver taciturn, and the village seemed emptier than when he had left it. Even the inn looked withdrawn, its curtains half drawn as though keeping out more than the dusk. Tuppence met him at the door before he could knock. She was still in her walking coat, her cheeks flushed and her gloves streaked with earth. "Tommy, thank heaven you're back." He blinked. "What's happened? You look as if you've been digging for treasure." Her eyes gleamed. "Not treasure. Something far better." "Meaning?" She lowered her voice. "A discovery. Come with me." He followed her up the lane, his suitcase bumping against his leg. The sky was bruising toward twilight, that brief hour when the birds go silent and even the wind seems to listen. They turned the corner behind the churchyard, where the vicarage gardens sloped toward a cluster of yews. "There," she whispered, "just behind the wall." Tommy stopped. The earth had been disturbed, a patch of raw soil darker than the rest, roughly spaded and partly filled in again. Beside it, a small terrier sniffed industriously at the ground, tail wagging. "Good heavens," Tommy murmured. "You haven't—" "Not yet. The vicar's wife said the dog started it this morning. I waited till dark to finish the job." He stared at her. "You mean to say—" "Yes, Tommy, we're going to dig," he sighed. "If this ends with us explaining to the local constable why we're desecrating the vicar's flower bed, I'm letting you do all the talking." "Agreed," she said briskly, producing a trowel from her coat pocket. By the time the church clock struck 9, the earth had given up its secret. Not a body, thank heaven, but a small tin box, the kind once used for biscuits. It was wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with garden twine, and buried just deep enough to suggest haste rather than panic. Tuppence sat back on her heels, brushing soil from her gloves. "She hid it," she breathed. "Eleanor Drake hid this herself." "Or someone wanted us to think she did," Tommy murmured. He took out his pocket knife and cut through the twine. Inside were several items, neatly packed despite the damp, a bundle of photographs, a woman's gold ring set with a small sapphire, and an envelope torn clean across the middle. The writing on it was unmistakable, the same elegant slant as the letter that had first summoned them to Hollow End. "To Victor," Tuppence read aloud, her voice hushed. "And the ink, it's identical." Tommy turned the photographs under the lamplight from his torch. The first few were ordinary enough, the drake standing before the hall, a garden party, a woman feeding swans by the lake. But the last photograph made him stop. "Well, well," he murmured. It showed the same couple at the village fete, Eleanor in a pale dress, Victor beside her, but behind them stood another figure. A man, tall, clean-shaven, wearing a dark suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you recognize him?" Tuppence asked. "No. Do you?" She shook her head slowly. "I thought perhaps he might be her brother, but she never mentioned one in the letter. And look, he's standing too close. Not family close, something else." Tommy studied the man's posture. Confident fellow, comfortable in front of a camera. But he's watching her, not the lens. They both fell silent. The sound of the river beyond the hedge filled the pause like breath between sentences. Tuppence took up the ring, holding it so the lamplight caught the stone. A wedding band, and yet she hid it away. Why? "Maybe she meant to run," Tommy said thoughtfully. "People don't bury mementos unless they're trying to leave them behind." She glanced up. "Or protect them." He looked at her sharply. "Protect them?" "From whoever was watching her," she said. "Mrs. Lacey told me she saw Eleanor out here one night, carrying something heavy, like a box. That must have been this." Tommy frowned. But if she buried it, she knew she was in danger. And if she knew that, why didn't she leave outright? Perhaps she couldn't. They carried the box back to the inn under cover of night, keeping to the shadows along the lane. Mrs. Lacey was already in bed, and the front parlour was dark, save for the dying embers in the hearth. Tuppence spread the contents carefully across the table, while Tommy poured 2 small glasses of brandy. "She was afraid," Tuppence said softly. "That letter wasn't written on impulse, and it was a last attempt. She must have suspected her husband was up to something." "Financially he was," Tommy said, settling into a chair. "Felton the solicitor practically choked when I mentioned it. Drake sold off half her inheritance before she vanished. Neat timing, wouldn't you say?" "And she found out?" He nodded. "Which means she had proof. These photographs, maybe that's why she kept them. That unknown man might be tied to the sales." Tuppence picked up one of the photographs again, studying the stranger's face. "He's younger than Drake. Smarter, perhaps. Look at his hands. Neat, not a labourer's. A professional, solicitor, banker, something of that sort. Tommy smiled. I married a detective. You married trouble, she said, but her tone was fond. He leaned forward. If Eleanor was being watched, that explains the letter, and the burial. But it doesn't explain who dug the path out behind the vicarage, or why people are still so terrified to talk. She looked at the torn envelope again, fingertips tracing the ink. Someone else came here after her, someone who knew exactly where to look. If the dog hadn't found the spot, he topped up her glass, we'd still be thinking she was lost to the mist. Tuppence gave a small smile, and you'd still be pretending to enjoy Mrs. Lacey's pudding. The next morning dawned deceptively peaceful. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, catching the dust motes like tiny golden secrets. Tuppence woke early, restless, and found Tommy already at the table, reading over the photographs again. Anything new? She asked. Only questions. The fate photo intrigues me most. Why would she keep that one, unless it mattered? It must have been taken shortly before she disappeared. Everyone looked so unconcerned. Tuppence glanced out the window toward the churchyard. You think she buried it soon after? Likely. And if she was being watched, she may have chosen a spot near the vicarage because it felt safe. Tuppence smiled faintly. No one expects danger near roses and hymnals. Tommy folded the photo carefully. We'll take these to the hall today. See if Miss Pusey knows our mysterious gentleman. Tuppence's eyes glinted. And if she doesn't, she'll certainly pretend to. Either way, we'll learn something. They spent the morning making casual inquiries around the village. At the post office, no one remembered the fate at all. At the shop, Mrs. Trimble swore she hadn't seen a photographer in years. But when they reached the edge of the green, they encountered Colonel Harbottle, adjusting his binoculars with soldierly precision. Morning, Tommy said genially. Fine weather for bird-watching. The colonel jumped slightly, then scowled. Birds don't need fine weather, they need discipline. Tuppence smiled. I wonder if you were at the summer fete last year, Colonel. There was a photograph taken, rather charming, of Mrs. Drake and her husband. His expression froze. Why do you ask? Oh, just curiosity. You strike me as a man who notices details. He hesitated, then said curtly, There was a photographer, yes, outsider. Said he was collecting images for a magazine, local life and so forth. Didn't care for him. Too smooth by half. Do you recall his name? No, but he had one of those new motorbikes, black foreign make, roared like artillery. Left the same evening, thank heaven. Tommy met Tuppence's eye. Interesting, he said softly. That night back at the inn, they examined the photo again. A stranger with a camera, arriving just before Eleanor disappears, Tommy murmured, and a husband suddenly flush with cash. And a woman terrified enough to bury proof, Tuppence finished. She lifted the sapphire ring again, turning it slowly in the lamplight. Do you think she meant us to find it, Tommy? That letter was mislaid, or delayed, by someone who didn't want us here. Maybe fate wanted a second chance, he said lightly. Tuppence smiled, though her eyes were shadowed. Or perhaps fate's hiding in a hedge with a motorbike. They both laughed softly, but the sound held unease. Outside, the night wind stirred the garden beyond the window, whispering through the grass where, only a day before, a frightened woman had buried her last secrets. And in that whisper, faint and fleeting, it almost sounded as though the village itself was trying to warn them that something, or someone, was still watching. Tuppence woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was part of her dream, something about a clock ticking too loudly in an empty room, but then she heard it again, slow, deliberate, crunching softly over gravel just outside the window. She sat up, every sense alert. The inn was silent otherwise. Even the old beams had ceased their nightly groaning. She slipped out of bed and crossed to the window, her bare feet whispering against the rug. The curtains stirred faintly as she peered through the narrow gap. A figure was moving along the lane. The light of a lantern bobbed in the darkness, haloing the mist that had crept in from the fields. The figure walked with purpose, not stealth, yet there was something about the rhythm of those steps that made her shiver. The lantern's glow revealed only glimpses, the curve of a hat brim, a coat hem brushing against the weeds at the verge. Then she saw where it was heading, toward the path behind the church, the hollow path. Tuppence turned at once, reaching for her robe. "Tommy," she hissed, "wake up!" A muffled groan came from the adjoining room. "If this is about biscuits, I'll shoot the baker." "Get up," she insisted. "There's someone outside with a lantern." That got him. Within moments, Tommy appeared at her door, hair rumpled, pulling on his dressing gown. What sort of someone? The walking, glimmering kind. Going toward the hollow path, he frowned. At this hour? Apparently the witching hour comes early in Hollow End. She was already lacing her shoes. Hurry! The night air was sharp as they stepped outside. Mist curled in pale ribbons along the ground, wrapping the hedges in a ghostly sheen. The village lay utterly still. Only the faint chime of the church clock marked the hour, 1 o'clock. They followed the lane past the inn garden, keeping to the shadows. Ahead, the lantern flickered intermittently, swallowed now and then by the fog. Whoever carried it was tall, moving steadily toward the path that sloped behind the vicarage. "Can you see who it is?" Tuppence whispered. "Not yet," Tommy murmured. "Could be our farmhand friend Ned, or the Colonel on a bout of insomnia." "Colonel Harbottle doesn't strike me as the creeping type." "True," Tommy said. "He'd bring a bugle." They moved closer. The mist grew thicker, wrapping them in damp silence. The lantern's glow dimmed until it was only a vague shimmer between the trees. Then, quite suddenly, it vanished. Tuppence stopped short. "Where?" "Gone," Tommy said quietly. "Just like that." He swung his torch beam toward the hollow path, but the light seemed to bounce uselessly off the fog. No footprints, no sound, only the faint trickle of water from the brook below. "Tommy," she whispered, "this place, it feels wrong." He took her hand. "Then let's be wrong somewhere warmer." They turned back, moving quickly up the lane. Yet as they reached the inn gate, Tuppence glanced over her shoulder. For a moment, she thought she saw a second light, distant, wavering, like someone watching them from the hedge. But when she blinked, it was gone. Morning brought a deceptive calm. The mist had burned away, leaving Hollow End looking almost cheerful under the pale sun. Birds called from the eaves, and Mrs. Lacey was polishing the inn counter with the fervour of one exorcising evil. "You heard it too, then?" she said as Tuppence came down for breakfast. "Heard what?" "The footsteps," Mrs. Lacey whispered, glancing toward the door, "and the bell at the churchyard. It tolled once, just after 1. "I didn't hear the bell," Tuppence said. "Oh, it tolled all right. My husband said it was the hollow path calling another." Tuppence arched an eyebrow. "And who's another this time?" The woman hesitated, lowering her voice. "Ned Waverley, the farmhand, didn't come home last night." Tuppence's spoon paused midway to her lips. "Gone missing?" "So they say. His mother's half mad with worry. They're out looking now, down by the river, and the old footbridge." "Perhaps he's simply gone to market," Tuppence suggested gently. Mrs. Lacey shook her head. "He wouldn't go without his tools, or his dog. They found the dog sitting by the gate this morning, whining." Tommy entered just in time to hear the last words. "Bad business that," he said, "though not surprising. The lad warned us the path shifts when it wants to. Seems it shifted him clean out of existence." "Don't joke," Mrs. Lacey said sharply. "There's a curse on that path." Tuppence met Tommy's eyes. "Or someone wants us to think there is." After breakfast, they set out again, following the track toward the forge. The village seemed subdued. People spoke in low tones, their faces shuttered. A few nodded stiffly as the Beresfords passed, but most turned away. At the forge, the door was open, but the hammer was silent. Inside, the air smelled of cold ash. Mr. Mallory stood by the workbench, staring at something in his hand. "Morning," Tommy greeted. "Heard about the search?" Mallory nodded grimly. "Poor lad. Foolish to be out after dark." "You think he was on the path?" Tuppence asked. "Likely. He had a fancy for dares, said no curse could scare him. Looks like he found one that could." She noticed what he was holding, a lantern, caked in dried mud. "Where did you get that?" "Found it by the fence just now. Looks like one of ours from the farm sheds." She stepped closer. The glass was cracked, the handle smeared with clay. "May I?" He handed it over without protest. Tuppence examined it carefully. There was something odd about the wick. It had been soaked recently, not in oil, but in some thicker substance that smelled faintly chemical. "Lantern oil mixed with paraffin," she murmured. "It burns fast and bright, perfect for a show." Tommy frowned. You think last night's apparition was staged? I don't think. I know. Someone wanted us frightened off, and they nearly succeeded. Mallory looked uneasy. Best leave this business, Mrs. Blunt. Nothing good comes of stirring the hollow. She met his gaze squarely. I rather think something's already been stirred. By midday, word of Ned's disappearance had spread through the village like smoke. Groups of men searched the fields. The vicar led a prayer at the church porch. Tuppence and Tommy watched from the green, piecing together fragments of overheard conversation. Some say he fell in the brook, Tommy murmured. Others think he ran off to Ipswich for work. And then there are the ones whispering about ghosts. Tuppence's expression was thoughtful. Ghosts don't carry lanterns filled with paraffin. As they spoke, Miss Pusey passed by on the opposite side of the road. She looked different, her severe bun loosened, her eyes darting nervously beneath the brim of her hat. She carried a suitcase. Tuppence nudged Tommy. Well, well, our housekeeper's taking an early holiday. They crossed the road. Miss Pusey, Tuppence called brightly. Leaving us so soon? The woman started, clutching her case. Oh, Mrs. Blunt, Yes, I'm going to London. A family emergency. How distressing. Will you be returning? Her lips thinned. I shouldn't think so. Tommy smiled pleasantly. Pity, the hall will feel quite empty without you. Miss Pusey's hand tightened on the suitcase handle. Some houses prefer to be empty, she said, and hurried away down the lane toward the station road, casting one quick look back at the hall. Tuppence watched her go. Family emergency, she murmured. Or fear. Perhaps both, Tommy said. If she knows who our midnight visitor was, she's wise to flee. Tuppence's gaze drifted toward the forge. Then we must be fools for staying. Delightful ones, he said. But you're right. Someone staged that lantern trick, and Ned's disappearance fits the pattern too neatly. She nodded slowly. There's method in all this. Frighten the villagers, send the housekeeper running, erase the witnesses. Someone's clearing the board, Tommy. Then we'd better make our move before it's our turn. That evening, as the village lamps flickered to life, the two of them sat by the inn's fire, pretending to read. Outside, the wind had risen again, whistling softly around the eaves. Tuppence turned the muddy lantern over in her hands. If Miss Pusey's gone, we're running out of suspects. Not necessarily, Tommy said. Sometimes the person who flees isn't the guilty one, just the frightened one. Then who's left? He looked up from the newspaper, eyes narrowing. Whoever's still watching the hollow path. Tuppence smiled faintly. Then we'll have to keep watch too. As she set the lantern down, a draught from the chimney stirred the flames. The light flared briefly across the walls, catching her reflection in the glass, and for an instant she could have sworn there was another reflection beside hers, darker, blurred, as if someone stood just behind her chair. But when she turned, there was no one there. Only the faint whisper of the wind, winding its way down the chimney, or perhaps, from far beyond, up the hollow path itself. Do you ever feel, Tuppence said thoughtfully, that the best traps are the ones baited with truth rather than lies? Tommy glanced up from the telegram forms spread across the inn's breakfast table. I feel that the best traps, my dear, are the ones that don't blow up in your face. Yours generally do. She ignored the jab, tapping her pencil against her chin. It has to sound official, just enough to rattle his conscience if he has one. He hasn't, Tommy said dryly, but rattling his nerves might do. Let's see. To Victor Drake, address unknown, forwarding via solicitor, concerning sealed confession of Mrs. Eleanor Drake recently discovered. Urgent presence requested to prevent formal inquiry. Tuppence smiled. Perfectly pompous. You sound like a cross between Scotland Yard and the Book of Common Prayer. He folded the telegram neatly. It should reach him at the London club listed in Felton's files. Men like Drake never stray far from their mirrors. She stood, adjusting the vase of flowers on the table with unnecessary precision. Then all that remains is to wait, which, as you know, I do about as well as a cat in a rain barrel. Tommy leaned back. Patience, Mrs. Blunt. By tomorrow, we may have our mouse. The mouse arrived sooner than expected. By the following afternoon, a motor car rolled up the lane to Hollow End Hall, gleaming under the weak sunlight. Its driver, tall, impeccably dressed and radiating charm like perfume, stepped out and surveyed the house as though it were a stage prepared for his entrance. Victor Drake, Tuppence murmured from behind the lace curtain of the inn window. You could spot that vanity from here to Piccadilly. Tommy straightened his tie. Time to play host. They had arranged the meeting under the pretext of solicitors' representatives, using Mrs. Lacey's drawing room for respectability. The tea things were set, the fire crackled, and the stage was properly lit. Drake entered with a smile that could have sold shares in sin. "Mr. and Mrs. Blunt, I presume. I must thank you for sparing me a trip to Suffolk Law Courts. Most inconvenient places, I'm told." Tuppence, perfectly polite, gestured to the armchair by the hearth. "We thought it better to settle things quietly." "Indeed." He removed his gloves slowly, revealing hands that were elegant but restless. "This talk of a confession, absurd, of course. My poor wife was not herself." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "How unfortunate. I was under the impression she was quite lucid, up to the day she vanished." Drake's smile thinned. "Lucid? You might say her mind was delicate. She imagined persecutions, conspiracies, wrote letters to strangers." Tuppence tilted her head. "Including us?" He blinked. "You?" "Yes," she said softly. "We were among her correspondence. She seemed rather frightened. Mentioned you often." Drake gave a short laugh, too sharp. "I'm not surprised. Guilt does strange things to the imagination." "Guilt?" Tommy asked pleasantly. "She had an accident years ago," Drake said quickly. "Her father's estate was nearly bankrupt. She blamed herself. Since then, moods, delusions. I cared for her as best I could." Tuppence poured tea, her movements calm. "How noble of you. I wonder, then, why you sold her properties without her knowledge." His cup rattled faintly against its saucer. She approved the transfers. "Strange," Tommy said. "Her solicitor didn't seem certain she ever signed them." Drake set the cup down. "You're very inquisitive, Mr. Blunt. Perhaps too much so." Tommy smiled. "That's my line of work." For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the mantel. Then Tuppence reached into her handbag and drew out something wrapped in a handkerchief. She set it gently on the table. A single gardening glove, soft leather, faintly embroidered with the initials E.D. Drake's eyes locked on it. His composure cracked. "Where did you find that?" "At the forge," Tuppence said evenly. "It was fresh, not 6 weeks old. Curious, isn't it? Unless Mrs. Drake returned after she disappeared." His hand twitched, then stilled. "It proves nothing." "Oh, it proves she was still alive, Nairn, or that someone wanted us to think she was," Tommy said. "Either way, you'll forgive us for wondering." Drake rose abruptly. "This conversation is over. You've overstepped." "Sit down, Mr. Drake," Tuppence said softly. "You've come a long way for a man with nothing to hide." He hesitated, then, against his better judgment, obeyed. She leaned forward. "Tell me, do you remember the fate photograph?" His expression flickered. "What photograph?" "The one with your wife," Tuppence said, "and the man standing behind you, the one she kept even when she buried the rest. Who was he?" Drake's face paled. "You've been trespassing." "So you do know him," she said quietly. For an instant his mask slipped, the polished charm gone, replaced by something raw and fearful. Then he stood, voice sharp. "My wife was unwell. She imagined threats where none existed. If you'll excuse me, I won't stay to indulge gossip." He turned on his heel and strode from the room. That night, the Beresfords waited. The moon was half veiled, the village sunk in quiet. They crouched near the church wall, where the path to the hollow began its downward curve. Tommy had his torch, Tuppence the muddy lantern from before. "He'll come," Tommy murmured. "He's too arrogant not to." "If he does, let's hope he's less charming in a shovel fight." "Remind me," Tommy said, "why our marriage always ends in nocturnal gardening." Before she could reply, a faint sound reached them, the scrape of metal against stone. They froze. Down the slope, a figure moved stealthily among the trees. The glow of a lantern bobbed in his hand, casting thin shadows across the ground. Then came the dull thud of a spade striking earth. Tommy gestured silently. They crept closer, keeping to the shadows. The man's back was turned, his coat collar up. Each movement was brisk, practiced. "Now?" Tuppence mouthed. "Now." They stepped forward together. Tommy's torch beam flashed on. "Good evening, Mr. Drake. Still doing a bit of landscaping?" The man spun around, shovel raised instinctively, then froze in the light. Victor Drake's eyes blazed with fury. "You again," he spat. "Are you following me?" "Just out for a stroll," Tuppence said sweetly. "We like to stretch our legs after blackmailing murder suspects." He dropped the spade, breathing hard. "You don't understand. I wasn't burying anything. I was hiding it." "From whom?" Tommy demanded. "From them," Drake said hoarsely, pointing toward the trees. "They're watching even now. You think you know this village, but you don't. Eleanor was terrified of them. She told me they'd come for her." "Who are they, exactly?" "The man in the photograph," he said, "and others, men from London. She got mixed up in something beyond her depth." Tuppence narrowed her eyes. "Then why bury evidence instead of going to the police?" "Because it would ruin her name," Drake said. "Even in death I wanted to protect her." "Chivalrous," Tommy said dryly. "Convenient, too." Drake's expression twisted. "You think I killed her? You fools, I loved her. I've been trying to keep her secret safe." "What secret?" Tuppence demanded. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and produced a small packet wrapped in oilskin. He tossed it onto the ground. "Read it if you must. She wrote it herself, her confession." Tommy stooped, picking it up. The envelope was smeared with soil, the writing faint but legible. "To be opened only if I am gone." Tuppence stared at the words. "So it exists after all." Drake nodded slowly. "She left it for me to destroy. I came tonight to finish what I should have done weeks ago." Tommy's tone was skeptical. "And what's in it?" Drake's voice dropped. "Enough to damn her, and me." They took his arm and walked him back toward the village. By the time the inn's lamps were dimmed, the local constable had been sent for and Victor Drake was under watch in the vicar's study. They escorted him back to the inn, the packet clutched between them like a living thing. Once inside, under the steady light of the lamp, Tommy slit it open with his penknife. A few pages lay within, written in a woman's delicate hand. Tuppence read the first lines aloud. "If anyone finds this, know that I was afraid. Victor believes I am ill, but I am not. They want me to sign away the land for what lies beneath it. I have seen the map. The hollow path is not a path at all. It is an entrance." Tommy exhaled. "An entrance to what?" Drake's voice came from the shadows. "To a chamber. Old, sealed. Her father knew of it. They said it held valuables, relics. She refused to open it, said it was cursed. I thought she was mad until—" He broke off, his face pale. "Until she vanished," Tuppence finished quietly. He nodded once. "She must have gone to prove something, and never returned." Tuppence folded the letter. "Then we'll prove it for her. Whatever truth she hid, it's still under that path." Drake's gaze flickered between them. "You don't understand. You'll end up like her." Tommy smiled grimly. "We'll take our chances." The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the soft hiss of the lamp. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the hedges as though echoing the same warning. Some paths should never be walked twice. The morning after Victor Drake's capture began with an uneasy stillness. Even the birds seemed to hold back their chatter, as if the village itself waited to hear what he would say. Tommy and Tuppence sat opposite Drake in the vicar's study, chosen precisely because it looked honest. Drake, for his part, seemed diminished, his hands restless on the armrest, his earlier swagger gone. He looked every inch the man cornered by his own reflection. "You realize," Tommy said quietly, "that what you've told us so far doesn't fit the facts. A confession, a missing wife, a buried packet of letters, they all suggest deliberate concealment." Drake's eyes flickered. "I told you, I was trying to protect her. Eleanor discovered something she shouldn't have, about me." "Go on," Tuppence said. He hesitated, then spoke quickly, as though afraid courage might desert him halfway through. "I'd been forging documents. Not hers, mind you, but signatures on small transfers. The estate was bleeding money. I was desperate. Eleanor found out. She was furious, not because I'd lied to her, but because it tied her name to a scandal. I tried to explain that I could fix it, repay it, but she wouldn't listen." "And then she vanished," Tommy said. Drake nodded miserably. "I thought she'd gone to London to expose me. Then I received a note, unsigned but in her hand, asking me to meet her here in Hollow End. She said she'd found proof of something far worse than forgery. But when I went to the place she named, she was gone, completely gone." Tuppence folded her hands. What place? The forge. The word hung between them. The forge was dark and still when they arrived that afternoon, Mallory nowhere to be seen. Dust lay thick on the workbench, and the cold smell of old soot lingered in the air. Light from the small windows fell in narrow shafts across the stone floor. Drake moved with a kind of haunted familiarity. This is where she said she'd meet me. I came that night, not long before Miss Pusey vanished, as I learned later. You didn't mention that before, Tommy said dryly. I didn't know it mattered. Tuppence's tone was gentle but edged. Everything matters, Mr. Drake. Drake crossed to the centre of the floor and knelt, running his hands along the planks. There was a loose board here. I remember hearing it creak. Mallory always meant to fix it. Tuppence crouched beside him. There. She pointed to a small gap between two boards, faintly outlined by dust that had been disturbed. Tommy fetched a crowbar from the bench and pried the boards up carefully. Beneath was a hollow space, deeper than a cellar, more like a vault carved into the earth. A faint scent rose from below, damp wood, old iron, and something else, something faintly sweet. Drake lit a lantern and lowered it into the opening. The flickering light revealed a narrow ladder descending into darkness. Tuppence met Tommy's eye. Shall we? He gave her a rueful smile. After you, Mrs. Blunt. Ladies first into hell. The air below was heavy, pressing close. The lantern light caught glints of metal and wood, the remnants of old smithing tools, a small stool, and against one wall a wooden chest half buried under rags. Tuppence stepped closer. The chest was unlatched. Inside lay a small leather-bound book. She picked it up, brushing dust from the cover. Eleanor Drake's journal, she whispered. Drake's voice came shakily behind her. That's her handwriting. She opened the book. The pages were dense with neat script, the ink faded but legible. The entries began innocuously. Notes about the estate, her husband's debts, the villagers' gossip. But as Tuppence turned the pages, the tone changed. She knew, she murmured. Listen to this. Victor is hiding something from me. Something beyond money. Miss Pusey knows more than she lets on. She comes to the house late at night. I hear them whispering in the conservatory. Tommy exhaled slowly. That explains Pusey's devotion. Tuppence continued, voice lower now. I confronted her. She smiled and said the truth would ruin us both, but I won't let her win. I have proof. Tomorrow I shall meet a friend who can help me expose the lie. The writing broke off abruptly mid-sentence. The remaining pages were blank. Tomorrow, Tommy repeated softly. That was the night she vanished. Drake's face was pale. She must have hidden it here for me to find, but I never dared look. Or someone didn't want you to, Tuppence said. Her eyes swept the chamber again and stopped. In the far corner, half concealed by a pile of cloth, stood a small suitcase. It was old but familiar, brown leather, the initials MP faintly visible on the tag. Tuppence's voice dropped to a whisper. Miss Pusey. Tommy lifted the lantern higher. Good Lord. The cloth wasn't cloth at all, but a shawl, and beneath it lay the still form of the housekeeper herself. Her skin was waxen, her lips tinged with blue. A small glass vial rested beside her hand. Its contents long evaporated, but its label still legible. Cyanide of potassium. Drake recoiled. No, she can't be. Tuppence bent over the body. She's been here no more than a day or two. No struggle. She took it herself, or was meant to look as if she had. Tommy's gaze flicked to the journal. Guilt? Tuppence shook her head slowly. Fear, and someone else's hand on the bottle. They climbed back into the forge, the daylight above feeling harsh after the closeness below. Drake slumped against the wall, face buried in his hands. She must have known the game was up, Tommy said grimly. Blackmail doesn't end well for anyone. Tuppence set the journal on the table. It's all here. Pusey was blackmailing Eleanor, and likely Drake too. But there's more. Eleanor's last entry mentions meeting a friend, someone who could expose the lie. That wasn't Pusey. Then who? Tommy asked. Tuppence glanced toward Drake. Perhaps the man at the fete. Drake looked up sharply. You think he killed her? I think Eleanor was caught between two fires. Your forgeries and Pusey's extortion. That's enough to make anyone desperate. But the man in that photograph ties them together somehow. She trusted him enough to meet him here, and she never came back. Tommy paced the room, thoughtful. Pusey could have found out about the meeting, followed her, confronted her. Suppose things turned ugly. Eleanor tries to leave, Pusey panics, poisons herself later out of fear or remorse. Tuppence shook her head. Too tidy. Pusey wasn't the remorseful type. No, someone silenced her. The cyanide was her trademark. Remember, she said there was no telephone line at the hall. She'd cut it herself to keep messages from getting out. Drake groaned softly. You mean she was working for them? For the men Eleanor feared? Perhaps, Tuppence said. Or perhaps she was only serving herself. But either way, Eleanor's final clue lies with that missing man, and whatever secret her father's land was hiding. She turned to Tommy. The confession said the hollow path was an entrance. If Eleanor learned what lay beneath it, that's where we'll find the rest of the truth. Tommy nodded grimly. Then that's where we'll go, before anyone else does. They left Drake in the care of the vicar, promising to alert the authorities. Outside, Hollow End looked deceptively innocent. Children playing on the green, the baker sweeping his step, the sound of a cart rattling down the lane. But to Tuppence, the village felt like a stage set after the play. Too still, too arranged. As they walked back toward the inn, Tommy glanced at her. You're quiet. I'm thinking about Miss Pusey, she said, how she lived in the shadow of others and died beneath their feet. She wasn't good, but she wasn't entirely evil either. She was a servant who saw too much. Tommy smiled faintly. And you, my dear, are a lady who refuses to see too little. She looked ahead toward the churchyard, where the hollow path disappeared into the trees. We've uncovered deceit, theft, and murder, she said softly. But not Eleanor. Until we do, none of this is finished. He followed her gaze. Then we'd best not keep her waiting. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the grass, shadows shaped like steps descending into the earth. Somewhere beneath them, the truth waited, silent, sealed, and deadly as the cyanide bottle they'd left behind. Dawn came reluctantly to Hollow End, pale and cautious, as though even the sun mistrusted what the night had left behind. The village green was filled with murmuring figures in heavy coats, their breath visible in the chill air. At the edge of the brook, constables moved slowly through the reeds, their boots sinking into the black mud. Tuppence and Tommy stood behind the cordon, silent among the onlookers. The old footbridge, half collapsed from years of neglect, groaned faintly under the weight of one officer leaning over with a hook. The water, disturbed and dark, swirled in sluggish circles. Mrs. Lacey stood beside Tuppence, wringing her hands. They'll find her this time, she whispered. They always said the hollow keeps what it takes. Tuppence did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the water. She had seen enough searches to know that the most dreadful part was the waiting, that instant before truth broke the surface. A shout went up. The constable on the bridge hauled up the hook, and something pale and sodden came with it, a strip of fabric, clinging and heavy. He spread it on the bank, and the gathered crowd drew a collective breath. A scarf, pale blue silk, faintly patterned with forget-me-nots. Eleanor Drake's scarf. Mrs. Lacey crossed herself. God rest her soul. Tommy glanced at Tuppence. Her face was composed, but her hands were clenched at her sides. It could have been dropped earlier, he said quietly. Doesn't prove she drowned. No, Tuppence said, but it proves she came this way. The search widened as the morning brightened. Policemen worked methodically along the banks. Villagers whispered behind hedges. Hollow End had come to life again, though not in the way it wanted to. For once, silence no longer ruled the place. Gossip did. Tommy, restless, prowled the edge of the brook. You'd think half the county was buried here, he muttered. All this fuss for a scarf. Tuppence had drifted further down the path, her steps light but purposeful. Something in her had tugged her onward, an instinct sharper than reason. The brook curved through the meadow and narrowed into a trickle beneath an old willow. Beyond it, the ground sloped upward toward the shepherd's fields. She stopped suddenly. A figure stood there, half veiled by mist and distance, motionless among the rushes. A woman, thin, wrapped in a blanket or shawl, her hair loose and pale in the light. She seemed to be watching the scene by the bridge, but her posture was wary, almost frightened. Tuppence's heart gave a single hard beat. Eleanor, she breathed. The woman turned. For an instant their eyes met across the mist, and Tuppence saw it clearly. The delicate face, the shadowed eyes, the unmistakable likeness to the photograph from the fete. Then the woman turned and fled. "Tommy!" Tuppence called, already running. The ground was slick underfoot, the wet grass clinging to her shoes. Tuppence followed the figure across the meadow, through a gap in the hedge, and into the low hills beyond. The woman ran unsteadily, glancing back once as if uncertain whether to vanish or to be found. "Eleanor, please, wait!" The voice carried, soft and urgent. The woman stumbled, hesitated, and then, as if some dam within her broke, she stopped. Tuppence approached slowly, hands open. Up close she could see the trembling, the hollows beneath the woman's eyes, the cracked lips. Eleanor Drake, alive but ghostly, as though life had returned to her reluctantly. "You're safe now," Tuppence said gently. "We've been looking for you." Eleanor's voice came faintly, almost toneless. "They said I would be found," when the river spoke. Tuppence wrapped her coat around her. "You've been hiding," Eleanor nodded weakly. "I couldn't go back. They would have made me sign again, and if I refused—" Her breath caught. Tuppence supported her carefully. "No one's forcing you now. Come with me." From behind them came Tommy's voice, breathless but firm. "Found your morning stroll companion, have you?" Tuppence glanced back. "Tommy, it's her." He blinked, taking in the frail figure. Good Lord! So the hollow didn't swallow her after all. Eleanor managed the faintest ghost of a smile. Not yet. They brought her to the inn, where Mrs. Lacey's shock turned quickly to bustling compassion. Within an hour, Eleanor was seated by the fire, a mug of broth in her trembling hands. Her voice, when it came, was slow but steadier. "I went to the forge that night," she said. "I thought Victor would come, but Miss Pusey came instead." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a look. "She had found my journal," Eleanor continued, eyes distant. "She said she knew everything, about the forgeries, the false deeds. She wanted money to keep silent. I told her I'd expose both of them instead." She laughed. Tuppence leaned forward. "And then?" "I ran," Eleanor said simply. "I heard shouting behind me. Someone else came. A man's voice. Pusey screamed. I didn't wait to see what happened. I crossed the brook by the old bridge. It gave way beneath me and I fell. When I came to, I was downstream, bruised, soaked, terrified. I thought they'd think me dead, and for a time I wanted to be." Her hands clenched around the cup. "I found a shepherd's hut in the hills. Empty. I stayed there. I watched the lights in the village, but I didn't dare go near. I kept hearing the voices, theirs, arguing, blaming. I thought if I returned, they'd kill me." Tommy's voice was gentle. "No one's going to harm you now. The truth's out." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't understand. Victor forged the papers, yes, but I wasn't innocent. I signed some of them myself. I wanted to protect him. When I realized what it meant, when I saw the kind of men he was dealing with, it was too late." "The man from the fete," Tuppence murmured. Eleanor's eyes flicked to her. "You saw the photograph?" "Yes. He was one of them, not a friend, a creditor. Pusey was working for him. She was supposed to keep me quiet. But greed makes fools of us all. She thought she could outwit them. They poisoned her for it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Tommy stirred. "Then Drake isn't a murderer?" "No," Eleanor whispered. "Only a coward. I've hated him for what he did. But he didn't kill her. Or me." Tuppence reached out, touching her hand. "You've done enough, Mrs. Drake. Let the police untangle the rest." Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the window, where morning sunlight spilled through the glass. "Perhaps now," she said softly, "the hollow can breathe again." By evening, word came that Ned Waverley had been found exhausted but alive farther upstream. He remembered only following a light by the brook before slipping and knocking his head. The curse of the hollow path, Tuppence noted, had a very human stage manager. By noon, Hollow End was transformed. News of Eleanor's reappearance spread faster than disbelief could catch up with it. The villagers' silence, that tight, fearful quiet, began to crack like ice under thaw. Constables came and went. Reporters were turned away at the lane. Victor Drake, informed of his wife's survival, broke down completely. The fraud would ruin him, but at least he was not a killer. And as the shadows lengthened over the fields, the Beresfords packed their suitcase at last. "Do you know," Tommy said, folding his tie with exaggerated care. "I rather liked Hollow End better when it was silent. All this moral rehabilitation makes a man feel out of place." Tuppence laughed softly. "Admit it, Tommy. You'd be miserable without scandal." "I'd be content with a case that doesn't involve midnight digging or forged deeds. You'd be bored within a week." "Possibly," he conceded, "but I'd have fewer muddy shoes." That evening, in their Chelsea flat, the world felt mercifully ordinary again. Rain tapped softly against the window panes, and the glow from the fire painted the room in amber. Tommy was at the sideboard, measuring tea leaves with military precision. "Strong, medium, or diplomatic?" he called. "Diplomatic," Tuppence said, curled up in her armchair with a sheaf of papers. "We've had enough drama for 1 week." He poured the water with a flourish. "Milk first or last?" "Stop provoking the British Empire and sit down. I'm reading." She held up a letter, the last page of Eleanor Drake's recovered confession, sent from her hospital bed that morning. Her voice, when she read aloud, was low and clear. "I cannot undo what was done, but truth is a kind of freedom. If you ever find yourself wondering whether to act or to hide, remember this. Silence may keep you safe, but it will not keep you whole." Tuppence lowered the page slowly. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. Tommy handed her a cup of tea. "A moral to the story," he said lightly. "Uncommon in our line of work." She smiled. "Perhaps we needed one." He settled opposite her, stretching his legs toward the fire. "So, Mrs. Beresford, what do you propose for our next adventure?" Tuppence sighed contentedly. "Next time, Tommy, remind me not to answer the post." Tommy grinned. "And miss all this excitement?" "Not a chance." The kettle hissed on the hearth, the fire flared, and somewhere outside London murmured its eternal, comfortable noise, as if the world, having flirted with danger, was tucking itself safely back to sleep.